All right, thank you all very much. It's been a wonderful presentation so far. My name is Antonio Rodriguez, and today my thesis project, Marigloria Palma and the Puerto Rican beats, Voces Olvidadas of mid-century. Now, this project aims to offer additional views of mid-century American poetry and political activism. This is done by investigating the forgotten voices of Puerto Rican poets of color, namely, of course, Marigloria Palma, Juan Antonio Cortehead, and Julia de Burgos, who at the top, if it wasn't being covered up, as Juan Antonio Cortehead, Marigloria Palma, and Julia de Burgos. These three poets' lives converged in Harlem, New York City during the summer of 1944. The very same months that the American beats were converging here at Columbia University, our cohort was meeting just 2 miles away in Harlem, working for the Spanish language newspaper Pueblos Hispanos. They're pictured here in 1944 at Pueblos Hispanos and here in better headshots. We have Marigloria Palma on the left, Julia de Burgos, and Juan Antonio Cortehead. So, who were the Puerto Rican beats? First, we have Julia de Burgos, who is by far the most well-known and analyzed figure of our central cohort. Popular knowledge of her work was resurrected due to the 1994 publication of A Song of Simple Truth, which was a compilation and comprehensive translation by Jack Agueros, the New York City councilman, director of Museo del Barrio, and poet himself. Now, in the 1990s, these translations were taught across the United States as part of a curriculum for Pan-Latino and Pan-Chicano communities that were hungry for diverse literary heroes. In fact, I had this very distinct memory of being taught the poem Rio Grande de Luisa, which is perhaps Julia de Burgos' most famous poem, while I was in elementary school. Outside of her written work, she's most widely remembered for the tragedy of her death at just the age of 39, as well as the well-documented intervention into her life by the FBI. Now, a note on the translator of this book. He was a fascinating subject in himself, and after his death, Jack Agueros' papers, here's Jack, were acquired by Columbia University. It's a fascinating archive that has so many personal documents held by Julia de Burgos and scanned in copies that are extremely difficult to find. In fact, I found this image in that archive. You can actually see Jack Agueros' handwriting here at the bottom. And this image notes that this is a meeting of the Women's Auxiliary of the Nationalist Party here in the city. That would be the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. Our next character is Juan Antonio Cortehead, who is better remembered for his political activism than his poetry. He participated in the Puerto Rican nationalist movement of the 1930s. And in 1936, he, along with the rest of the leadership committee of the Partido Nacional, the Puerto Rican nationalist movement, were arrested and actually sentenced to 10 years in prison for sedition. Sedition is an extremely rare federal crime that was most recently used in the January 6th rioters. And actually, I was watching the news and about the sentencing around January 6th, and they actually cited this 1936 Puerto Rican nationalist arrests as part of the only times that this extremely rare sedition charge was held. But from prison, Juan Antonio Cortehead published his poetry as well as essays, including his seminal work, The Struggle for Independence of Puerto Rico. Like much of the work from this cohort of people, the ones that are translated into English from their original Spanish are the only ones that really stick around. So this text is actually still available on Amazon in its translation. It's translated by his wife, who was in that photograph from the beginning. Consuela Tapia. Uh, Now there's some so after prison, he by 1942 he was released from prison and he stays in the United States. He actually went to prison in the United States, even though all of his activism was on the island. So he stays in the United States and becomes the founding editor of Pueblos Hispanos. This is actually the broadsheet of the first issue in 1944, from that year in 1944. And as from this position of power, his notoriety and his literary contributions actually pull both Julio de Burgos and our next subject, Marigloria Palma, to New York City from the island. Now, there's a ton of evidence. Yes. Go ahead and mute yourself if you're on the stream, but there's a great amount of evidence that he's still being surveilled by the FBI in the 1940s. And it's his proximity to Julio de Burgos that likely caused the FBI to investigate her and intervene in her life as well. Now, his poetry mainly dealt with political struggles and revolutionary struggles, and they were collected and published by the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture in 1976. Finally, we have Marigloria Palma, who is the central figure of this cohort. She's simultaneously the most widely published, longest lived, and yet somehow paradoxically most obscure of our central cohort of characters. So obscure, in fact, that the dates of her birth and death are still debated amongst the small community of scholars who are interested in her work. Often her contemporaries would write about her quote unquote disappearance, when in reality, she actually got married and moved out to Los Angeles, where she got involved in painting and the art community of the 1950s, late 40s and 1950s Los Angeles. It's from there where she continues to write and becomes a professor at Caltech, along with her husband, Alfred Stern, who was an Austrian philosopher who fought in both World War I and World War II. She travels widely at this point and actually is returning from Europe in 1953, the same summer that Julio de Burgos was being transported back to Puerto Rico after her death. She's a fascinating character, and a lot of the work that I'll be submitting as part of our products of this thesis deal with her. So what does this work actually look like? The main thing here, one of the biggest pieces of this project has been translating various documents. All of these writers wrote exclusively in Spanish. And so first, that makes their work difficult to find. And second, there's a big language gap for younger cohorts of people. So there are two major translations that I've been working on. First is Bolitas de Marmal, un autobiografía rimada. That's Marvel's rhyming, an autobiography in rhyming verse written by Marigloria Palma and published in 1982. This is actually a page from that book, and it's fascinating because she does these. She's recounting these memories of her life, and this is a page where she's describing the assassination of President Kennedy in the 60s and in 63. And she goes on to describe how it influenced their decision to return to Puerto Rico, feeling that perhaps there was some sort of rising fascism here in the United States mainland. And later on, she talks about her memories of Hitler and her memories of the Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, where she visited in her youth. Second is La Poesía de Palma, Marigloria Palma, 40 años en de Caminos Poéticos, the poetry of Marigloria Palma, 40 years in street poetics. This is a 1990 dissertation from Rutgers by Diana Judith. It's really comprehensive, and it actually reviews all of her 16 books of poetry, which are still out of print to this day. There are a couple of other translations I'm working on. In addition to that, are a couple of essays that I've been writing over the past 5 years, most important of which are Julia de Burgos and Marigloria Palma, which uh, examines the relationship between the two women. And while they grew up just 5 miles from each other on the island, they never met until they moved here to Harlem and began working together. Uh, Marigloria Palma describes this as though they were butterflies flying over each other's tracks. She's got this wonderful imagery all throughout her writing. And additionally is the mercurial racial identity of Marigloria Palma. Both her and Burgos were Afro-Puerto Ricanas, but depending on their context within the United States, they were perceived and treated differently. In New York, they're treated as white. On the island, they're treated as Afro-Puerto Ricanos. And finally is the archive. Now, I know that this is just a photo of a Google Drive, but this is actually the most exciting part of this project. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been scanning and documenting, gathering all of these extremely rare resources into a place that is searchable and accessible to other researchers interested in this period. This includes maybe about 5 books that are available through Columbia. There's an extremely limited number of her books available at Columbia, Yale, and the New York Public Library. I scanned the ones I found here, as well as a literary journal that she founded in the 1990s as a professor. And there are various news articles and magazine articles as well. These are the covers of 2 of her books. And I want to point this out to any researchers who might be interested. This book, Viento Salado, is a novel about the queer, intersectional, elderly, disabled communities of 1950s Los Angeles. This is it. Like just like that, knowing that much, it's like you're searching for culture, you're searching for identity, you're searching for heroes, and we just need to yank it back out and make it accessible generation. I just want to note one more thing. Whoever is not muted. Today is my 5th wedding anniversary, and I want to say hello to Kristen Tuttle, who's watching the stream. Thanks.
Antonio,
That may have been Desi, my son, maybe.
I would maintain that you may have 2 projects here, just as an agent of change to reclaim and recover and archive, this project. And then, of course, your analysis or unpacking some of these works. I wonder, though, particularly, they've all left an indelible impression, but, we want to continue that story, that narrative. But when you look at specifically like Palma, part of this decision is probably predicated on what you could recover that's accessible, but what went into your decision making with determining, I want to sort of look at this one a little more than versus this one, or was it's all just beautiful stuff and it all needs a larger platform?
Which works? I mean, the works I targeted were the ones that I found most useful for translation anyhow. I found like 4 or 5 books of her poetry. This is her first one from 1942. There's another 80s called Versos de cada día, everyday verses. But the ones that really stood out to me as being important, the goal here is to resurrect or revive this cohort of writers, right? So I think the most important one would be Bolitos de Marmal. This is literally an autobiography. Now, up until 3 or 4 years ago, there were no known photos of Marigloria Palma. There are literally only 2 or 3 people working on her. And we've been able to yank photos out of the archives that were completely obscure and present them for viewing and for use. So Bolitos de Marmal is definitely, it tells her entire life story. It recounts her time in New York, who she met there, where she worked. She worked on John Street in Lower Manhattan, which is literally where I work now. So in terms of that active revival, Bolitos de Manuel stood out, as well as the dissertation by Diana Judith. These are just great reference works for writers interested in this period and these characters. Yeah, that's how I chose them.
A quick archival question. I'm wondering, you didn't mention it, Central in that community. You may have
yeah. So Their most important archive here, right? So you're referring to the Center of Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. I've reached out to them. I've talked to them a little bit. Their most important would be the archives of a newspaper. Now, when Marigloria Palma moved back to the island, she worked for the University of Puerto Rico, and she also wrote a column, a weekly column in a newspaper called El Diario, or the diary. Not to be confused with the diary here in the city, but on the island. And they have the copies of the newspaper. She had a weekly column for almost a decade. That would be invaluable to add to this. But as far as her books and novels, I wasn't able to find much in their special archive.
Making that stuff public and what the obstacle to that might be,
Yeah.
what the value of that might be.
Yeah. So
People are grateful to see something.
Sure. So if anyone's super interested, her primary translator is a recent PhD graduate here at Columbia named Karina Dalvaya Shorsky. And she actually began translating some of her works as early as 2016, but they're individual poems and this and that. The big problem is the publishing rights, right? So most of her works were published by the Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueño, which is a state-funded publishing house on the island. So the big problem would be getting the rights to republish, right? Columbia University has something called Sundial House that is all about translating and republishing Spanish language translations or just translations. So I think they would be interested in finding those rights. But I've talked to Karina numerous times, and that's a project she's definitely working on, is getting those rights in order to republish. But obviously, so this is a private, archive, but I would be more than happy to share it with whoever is interested in researching the topic. Yeah.
Check the chat.
Oh, in the chat. Oh, thank you. All right, cool. Cool, awesome. Thank you so much.
And Tony, can I ask you one final question?
Sure, yeah.
I know we talked before about, maybe continuing to evolve this into a wider audience, podcast documentary. But I also wonder, you mentioned Central Latino Studies. These are really, I think they'd really be interested in your project and your effort to draw greater attention to these, artists that have left an indelible impression, but unfortunately over time are regrettably forgotten.
Yeah.
But you might want to consider some of those platform journals. I think they'd really be interested in, I've seen scholarship that's similar in terms of reclaiming, these lost narratives.
Yeah, thank you. The goal is resurrection, which is a term that came from my professor, Taylor Supley, I think it was, here at Columbia. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonio.